Now, we used Google Maps to go into Kelly's Ford and tour in satellite images Kelly's Ford. And so you have that GPS information, how to get there very easily. We're seeing that now there are apps for various battlefields. Anthony just showed me one before we started here. And so the Civil War Trust is offering these apps. You can download when you're at the actual site and be there and hear someone talking to you about where you're standing. What are the disadvantages and advantages both of the apps and that way of learning versus a page-turning guide like yours? What are the advantages and disadvantages of each? Because many of us are still stuck with paper and love it.
I think there's a place for both. I think, the way my book is laid out, it will take you with Lee and the Army of the Potomac and Pope when he comes in, all the way through 2 years. So you're following this story all the way through. And that'll get you to Henry Hill. And that's, I think, the newest app that just came out is a tour of Henry Hill at Manassas. And once you get there, my book is good for saying, if you look in this direction with this on your right, this is where B said his line, and Stuart came up from Chin Ridge, which is just on your left here behind the trees. But in the book, in the first part, I do play up the apps as well, because when the book, when it first went to print, the first one, which I think was Devil's Den, and the Wheatfield at Gettysburg. After that, I think a Fredericksburg one came out, both by the Trust. I think they're all great tools.
Of course, your book, you give actual addresses and places so you can actually get there by GPS.
Right.
Which the app may not give you. Before the program, Anthony and I were also talking a bit about, Anthony was telling me how we were looking at the possible demise of books themselves, and how everything was going to be imaged on the computer. So you don't have to, as a researcher, go anywhere, allegedly, to get the information. Yet, as Anthony was saying, you're losing some things when you don't have the manuscript in front of you, and you can't see some of the additions and things that may be, and even the handwriting that may give you clues to something that is either wrong or something more that you want to get. And you just mentioned something the same way about the battlefield. To be on it, to be there, is incomparable. You can't really do it another way, although there are tours now virtually of many places. I think it's better to be on the site instead of virtual, but not everyone can make it. But what are the advantages?
Well, the other big difference, and this is something that I learned doing the first book, and now every time I give a presentation or a book signing, I try to preach this is really the main reason to go visit these sites. Part of it is walking the field and seeing the terrain and seeing why this ridge was important and this hill was important. The other piece, though, besides just the feeling of being there, which I think a lot of us battlefield stompers get, sometimes you step on a field and you know what happened there and you know all the details, but for some reason something just really gets you inside. But there's another element too, and I think it's particularly true of folks who grew up like me in the North. Before I started writing these books, I had really not spent significant time in the South. I had driven through the South, I had seen some things in the South, but it was really the first time that I got off the interstate and would spend a week on the back roads talking to folks and really getting a sense of Southern culture and the differences between how I grew up looking at the war and how other folks grew up looking at the war. And even when you're on the field, you run into these folks. And I think the best part of these visits are the conversations you have with these people.
That's a very interesting point, because what you're saying now is it's your insight, the author's insight, And this is what I feel very strongly about. I got savage criticism when people said, why are you writing another book on Lincoln? I used to reply, put 500 artists in front of the same landscape and you come up with 500 different paintings, and none of them can be definitive. In other words, every author comes from a different background, different perspective, different sensitivities. What might be unimportant to one is important to another. So we see things differently. That's why there is always room for the printed word and for this new technology, because the people who are on these new apps, they are seeing it from one aspect. The author, like you in your book and me in my book, we see it from our perspective. And I'll give you an example. Nobody knew what Lincoln's voice sounded like. Well, a lot of people couldn't care less. They didn't bother to try and find out. I mean, we didn't have CDs in 1865. I hunted down diaries to such an extent that I found a corporal's diary. He was 20 years old. He fought himself to within 20 feet of Lincoln at the second inaugural, and he described in his diary what Lincoln's voice was like. He said Lincoln had a loud, rather shrill, distinct, far-reaching voice. And then Benjamin Brown French, when he learned that the 4 conspirators had been hanged, he said gleefully, in other words, the emotion coming out of a man who lived in the 19th century, we can relate to it through his writing. He said, I could have jumped on the shoulders of each as they hung, after the ancient manner of rendering death certain. So in other words, my perspective sees how important the diarist is, because the diarist is giving us the authentic voice of the time, of the period. And that's the role of the author, to put his special insight, his special perspective, special skills, special relevancy to the topic at hand. And we all come from different directions. So I'm not worried about apps, because they are written by individuals, just like I'm an individual author, you're an individual author. So we're giving the public the benefit of manifold impressions. And this is why I think they'll all survive.
Yeah, well, you both put that into your book, and they're very immediate, both of them, and that's what I think is going to draw people that are into these books, whether it's a guide, and people say, oh, it's a guide. It's more than a guide. You can find more than that, and the same with your book as well. I have numbers of questions here to ask, so let's get into this and kind of pithy questions and answers and see if we can get through them. Anthony, what do you think the greatest unanswered question of the assassination is?
Oh, there's no question in my mind, 2 of them. A paper trail to the Confederacy. I tried my hardest. I hunted down anything to do with Judah Benjamin, because he went to England, he became a famous barrister. This was the man that was most likely to have a paper trail, but he destroyed his papers. I didn't find anything. The other thing is David Herold, one of the 4 conspirators hanged. He was given special permission by General Hancock and the prison governor to write a confession. He volunteered, he wanted to write his confession. And it's in the prison governor's daily journal that when the court was not in session, Herold was allowed to sit there. He was with Booth until moments before Booth was shot. So this is a man who would know what Booth was thinking, not only prior to the assassination, but he would have enormous relevance, unique relevance, of being the only person to accompany the assassin on those 12 days during the escape. And nobody has been able to find it. I didn't speculate whether Stanton destroyed it, whether it was lost, whether it was misfiled in the...
18 missing pages? Was it 18 missing pages?
Not the 18 missing pages, no. The confession of Herold. But no, the missing pages are not as important to me, because I know that one of them was torn out to write the letter to Dr. Stewart and derisively saying, here's your money, you know, Booth was really saying, you've insulted me and now I'm going to insult you. He was giving it back in full measure. But no, Herold, what he wrote would have exposed so much we don't know. This is,
They weren't asking
you know,
those
the
questions.
Chicago Sun-Times described my book as, if not the definitive book on the assassination, and the story before and after, then the one that readers should turn to first. It was flattering, but there cannot be a definitive story. And I'll tell you why. Harold's confession is missing. There was $200,000 reward money. That corrupted so many people. They all wanted a slice of that money, and they were claiming to have done things that other people did so they could get a share of the reward money.
I was going to ask you about that, because here is Jones's book, Thomas Jones, who was with Lincoln, with Booth, and helped him in his trying to escape. And he wrote, long after the war, this book, telling his side of the story, because Booth was gone, couldn't tell his side. What about the sources that you look at? How do you assess the veracity of them? Those who wrote long afterward, like Jones or Samuel Arnold, and those who testified, like Lewis Weichman and John Lloyd, and the others you're talking about right now, who were looking for the reward money, and were jostling each other. How do you judge the veracity of each of those people?
There are so many judgment calls in the Lincoln assassination. For every 2 steps forward, I had 1 step back. I had to say to myself, how strong is this? I don't want to speculate or conjecture or anything like that in the book. I want to be as emphatic as I can. This is what happened. Thomas Jones wrote this book about 2 decades after the assassination. And he claimed that Booth, that Dr. Mudd had said to him, well, I did recognize Booth, but I really couldn't say so at the time. They were going to strung me up. I believe everything that Jones said. At that stage, he had nothing to gain other than some money from the book, and I don't think it was in it for that. He really risked he put his neck out there, he risked his life to get Booth across further south. People like the veracity of people like, who would you mentioned some names just now. Weichman. Lewis Weichman was a chief prosecution witness, and he said in court on March the 19th, I read in the New York Tribune, that there was a plot to kidnap Lincoln, take him to Richmond, and ransom him for Confederate prisoners. I wrote him off as a perjurer or forgetful, because I went through the New York Tribune at the microfilm in the Library of Congress 2 weeks before the March the 19th, 2 weeks after, drew a blank. And I said, this man's lying. But luck intervened. I went to New Oxford, 10 miles east of Gettysburg, with my daughter to look at antiques, 100 antique dealers. And we were there for hours, and I caught, hung up there, framed on the wall, high up, the word Lincoln and kidnap. I buzzed the front desk, they brought it down. It's a story that Weichman referred to. But I had been looking at 1865 in the Library of Congress, thinking he was referring to the year of the assassination. It was 1864. So, you see, immediately I knew Weichman was telling the truth, and this is because I not only had luck, but my sensitivity directed to finding out who's lying, who's not, was with me all the time, even during my leisure hours at an antique shop. And that's why Michael and I think we'll always survive against the apps, because we bring our trained minds all the time into our books. And that's why we can compete with apps at any time, because they are telling their story, we're telling our story, but we're